Well, hi there, faithful politics listeners and viewers. If you're joining us on YouTube, make sure that you like and subscribe, hit the bell button so you can make sure you're getting notifications about our content. It's great to see you guys again. I'm Josh Burtram. I'm the faithful host. And as always, we have our political host. Hey, Will, it's good to see you.
Hey, it's good to be seen, Josh. Thanks.
Absolutely. And today we have the pleasure of having a conversation with Professor Paul D. Miller. His PhD is from Georgetown University. He's a professor of the practice of international affairs at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and co-chair of the Global Politics and Security Concentration. He spent a decade in public service as a director for Afghanistan and Pakistan on the National Security Council staff, an intelligence analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency, and a military intelligence officer in the U.S. Army. His writing has appeared in Foreign Affairs, The Dispatch, The Washington Post, Providence Magazine, Mere Orthodoxy, The Gospel Coalition, Foreign Policy, and elsewhere. He's the author of several books, and we're going to talk to him today in particular about a book he wrote a few years ago, The Religion of American Greatness, but also anything else that comes along with that. And that particular book, The Religion of American Greatness, is through InterVarsity Press. And it's great to have you on the show today, Paul. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me on your show. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So I got to ask just if there's anything I missed in that introduction, kind of who is for our audience, it's a pretty diverse audience, who's Paul Miller and how'd you get into writing books about the religion of American greatness and Christian nationalism and things like that? What got you into this sphere?
So I'm a Christian. My wife and I attend a Southern Baptist church in the suburbs of D.C. You heard my bio. I mostly focus on international affairs, but about 10 years ago, I realized that foreign policy is downstream of national identity. And the kinds of things I was saying about America's role in the world were premised on a certain understanding of what it means to be an American. And that understanding just wasn't shared by a lot of Americans. A lot of Americans thought of our country differently. And specifically, the way they related their Christianity to American identity was different than the way I was doing it. So that led me on a half-decade-long project to research and write this book on Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism, to maybe anticipate your first question, I think Christian nationalism is the belief that America is a Christian nation and that the government should keep it that way. And that's just, I think, fundamentally at odds with the way I think about what it means to be an American. I'm a Christian, I love America, and I want America to do well and to be governed justly and wisely. I think that's a good thing for us to work for and pray for. But I don't think it's helpful to characterize our country as being a constitutionally Christian country. Obviously, we can recognize the ways that Christianity has influenced our nation, our culture, our history, and that's one thing. But to assert that our government has a responsibility to keep it that way, that's a statement about the relationship between government and the church, really. And I don't go there. I think that's an unwise way to think about American identity.
I'm curious, Paul, and I like asking these questions to a lot of our guests because in my experience, everybody that comes to this particular subject area, Christian nationalism, kind of the integration of faith and politics, like seem to have had like an aha moment where you're like, wait a minute, like the way that faith is being used kind of in the political sphere, bothers me because it doesn't seem like it's consistent with, what I know about the Bible, or what I know about American politics or whatever. So like, was there a moment for you where you're like, wait a minute, like Christians in this country are really trying to make it a Christian nation? And what about that moment, if there was one for you, that really kind of, send up red flags for you?
Yeah, so there's an aha moment. It's an aha moment about the right generally, and maybe not quite so much about Christian nationalism specifically, but I'll share this aha moment. It was November of 2015 when ISIS attacked Paris, killed 140 people at a nightclub. It was a terrible, terrible thing. And it was that was the occasion when Donald Trump, then running his first campaign for the presidency, said that we have to ban Muslim immigration into the United States, and we have to kill terrorists and their wives and children. Go look it up. It was in December of 15 when he said that. And when I heard him say that, I thought, this is wrong. This is unjust. This is not conservative. This is not the right And by the way, I'm sitting here working at the CIA and teaching about counterterrorism. I've got no soft spot here for jihadists, but I think that this is the wrong way to think about fighting a war against jihadists. It's quite plainly and obviously wrong, but Trump's poll numbers went up. It went up with conservative Republican voters on the right, I think most of whom profess Christianity. And that was my aha moment. Many of my fellow conservative Republican Christians are thinking differently about America's role in the world and what we do to combat our enemies in ways that I thought were just obviously unchristian. And yet somehow many American conservative Christians were perfectly fine with this. And that was when I thought, I do not understand my party anymore. It's also when it stopped being my party.
Wow. I really resonate with all of that, not in terms of that particular moment, because I think in 2015, I was like wondering and just basically not mesmerized, astonished, befuddled, bamboozled. No, that's not the right one. About how Donald Trump could actually be someone that we were taking seriously as a candidate.
Yep.
And yet that's exactly what happened. And he got my vote in 2016, which he did not get, by the way, in 2020 and 24. And so I wanted to make that announcement. People have already heard that. But if I'm thinking about like the historical context of this Christian nationalism, we've talked to a lot of people, and I got a lot of people that say this is a Christian nation. A lot of people, that's what I kind of grew up thinking, not like Christian nation, like, hey, the Bible becomes our constitution necessarily, but a Christian nation that like, hey, we were a nation that was founded by a bunch of Christians on Judeo-Christian, principles. And what's wrong with that? What's wrong with feeling like, we have morals? Doesn't every law have to have morals? Do we want to have secular, like is secularism all that better? And these are the kinds of things that I've, had in my mind, and a lot of my friends who are kind of like, is really Christian nationalism? I like Christians and I like my country. So what's wrong with being a Christian nationalism? I don't understand what's wrong with that. Maybe kind of address some of those things and help us really dig into, hey, this is where the inconsistency and the logical errors of reasoning are when we're thinking about the founding of our country, where we are, and what it means to be Christian nationalist.
Yeah, so look, God and country patriotism is generally a good thing. Sometimes there's a little bit of, I think, maybe not careful thinking about the relationship between church and state. But as I said, I love Jesus, I love America, and it's good to love them both. Let's keep them separate. Let's understand they are different things. Where the danger comes in, so it's appropriate to recognize historically Christianity has been by far the majority religion in America. It's been the shaping influence in our founding and our documents and our laws. It's all true. So I'm not denying that. It's different to say that our government should be in charge of keeping us a Christian people. For example, by mandating prayers in public schools. I think that's totally inappropriate. And I know there's some people out there who are like, what could be possibly wrong with praying in public schools? And my response to that has a lot to do with the importance of protecting the integrity of the church. As a Christian, I think the church is the true Christian nation, in a sense, right? It's the true gathering of Christians who are specifically and uniquely called to be a reflection of God's glory and uniquely empowered to be the voice, the body of Christ, the proclaimer of his gospel. And if you invite Caesar, if you invite the public authority, a government employee, to start leading prayers, mandatory prayers in a public setting, you're actually asking Caesar to start preaching the gospel. And that's wrong. It's wrong in principle to take that away from the church. It's also deeply dangerous because you never really know what kind of gospel Caesar is going to preach. I promise you, Pick up a book of history, any book of history, and you'll find examples of Caesars preaching gospels very convenient for Caesar, right? They are very good at hijacking religious rhetoric and symbols and language and deploying it to bless whatever it is that they want to do. So we need to be very careful about allowing Caesar to take over the roles of the church.
You know, we're about 10 minutes into this interview, and my Trump derangement syndrome requires me to mention something about Trump. So I'm going to do that right now. I can't avoid it. But I am curious on what your take is on Trump's effect on theology, kind of as a whole, and maybe sort of his role in either propagating Christian nationalism kind of in the mainstream, or shifting, the public's theology. So I'd really love to kind of get your sense on that.
Yeah, so Trump, number one, I think Trump is accurately called a nationalist. A lot of his rhetoric is pretty generically nationalist, and sometimes it's not specifically Christian. Sometimes, though, it is, particularly on the campaign trail. Look at all three of his campaigns. He's very consistent and particular and specific in appealing to Christians to vote for him to regain Christian power. If you listen to the speeches, if you look at the rhetoric, he's not really appealing to Christian principle. He's not saying, vote for me because I will reflect Christian principles of justice in how I govern. No, he's actually appealing to an identity group, to Christians, to say, hey, vote for me and I will get you back in power. I will empower your particular tribe, your group. So it's an appeal to Christian power, not Christian principle. That's definitionally Christian nationalism. To be very clear, to be very specific, since I'm a professor, I got to draw fine distinctions. It's not wrong to seek power. In a democracy, we all do that. Every time we cast a vote, we're seeking power. It is what you do with that power. And I'm afraid that what Trump's doing is appealing to Christians to get power, to keep their own power. It's a self-justifying thing, rather than using Christian power to actually do something with it. So Trump has empowered nationalists across the spectrum. Christian nationalists are part of that. I think it has corresponded with a shift in the way many Christians are thinking and talking about politics and about the relationship between church and state. There's now a revival, a cottage industry. There's a broad intellectual movement on the right among theologians, some pastors, and a lot of thinkers and pundits. So, for example, Yoram Hazony wrote his book, The Virtue of Nationalism, way back in 2018. And Stephen Wolfe wrote his book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, just a year or two ago. And in between, Richard Lowry wrote his book on the case for nationalism in, I think, 2020. And there's the National Conservatism Conference, and there's the Journal of American Greatness. There's a lot of institutions, there's a lot of intellectual output trying to make the case, the intellectual case, for nationalism and for Christian nationalism specifically. We just weren't having this conversation pre-Trump. Trump created a permission structure, a permissive environment for these kinds of arguments, for this kind of discussion. Not opposed to having a discussion. I just think these ideas are so obviously wrong. They weren't taken seriously before Trump. Trump gave them a new seriousness, and it's, I think it's wrong, and sometimes a little bit tiring to rehash these arguments that I thought were settled.
Yeah, it's interesting. I read William Wolfe's review of your book. I don't know if you've seen it or not. It was in the American Reformer, I think is the name of the. He essentially said, this is a book that never should have been published, because it's in line with its forward, David French and Sam Perry, and I mean it clearly did not. It struck a chord, I think, with those that you just described, that kind of have sort of these nationalistic tendencies.
Yeah, where do you see the mission of the church actually playing its proper role in political engagement? Like, what is an ideal? And I know, right, as an intellectual and as a professor, right, you're drawing fine distinctions and maybe we don't want to like state like, hey, here's some ideal or, that isn't necessarily well thought through. But I would love to hear if you do have the thoughts on it. Like traditionally, the church is focused on spiritual and transformation, discipleship. Well, I guess actually, in some ways, traditionally, the church has tried to get political power in many, many times during its long history. What do you think? Like, what is the relationship between the church? What should it be between the church and political engagement? Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, the church is inevitably political in the sense that it is should be shaping disciples of a different kingdom. And that will necessarily have implications for how we individual Christians go out into the secular public square and engage and work for justice. So there's going to be essentially a political spillover effect. Now, the church, I think, should recognize it has a role in its teaching and ministry to talk about secular politics. By secular, you know what I mean? I mean, of this age, that it should talk about this age politics in some sense. But let me suggest three kind of wrong models for how many churches have done this in the past. One model is quietism, where the church says, we don't talk about politics. It's too divisive or irrelevant. And we're just going to talk about just focus on the gospel, right? That quietism functionally teaches the Christian that their faith has no political implications. And that, I think, is false. That's sort of essentially false teaching. The second model is hyperpartisanship, where you say, my faith is embodied in one political party and one political party only, and to vote for the other party is sin, and you're not welcome in this church if you belong to that other party, right? That kind of rank partisanship, the equation of righteousness with your party is also wrong. And the third, maybe more common model, particularly in white evangelical churches, is the essentially a single issue, or really it's 2 or 3 issue advocacy, where you preach the gospel, you're quietist on most issues, and then you preach about the evils of abortion, and maybe gay marriage and the need for religious freedom, right? And that's what a lot of churches do. They will selectively engage on a couple of single issues. I think all three models are not well-rounded, healthy models of church teaching about politics. I think God says in the Old Testament, justice is the foundation of his throne. And what is required of us but to do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. Doing justice is a whole life obligation, and it is the foundation of God's throne. If we are to live out our Christian calling, we live it out in every single facet of our lives by trying to do justice everywhere. That's how I would want the church to begin thinking about and talking about and teaching about politics. What does it mean to do justice in every facet of your life? What does it mean to do justice within your family, within your workspace, within your neighborhood, within your school, within your community, and yes, within your nation, within your world? That's a beginning of a broader conversation. It just means preach the gospel holistically and apply it to all realms of your life. I think quite often pastors apply the gospel to our lives individually, within the family, within the church, and they stop. And there's just not a lot of conversation about what the gospel's implications are for the rest of life.
I think that's very accurate, and that's gold. And I hope that the people that are listening are tuning in, because this will add so much value to your life if you are willing to listen to it and wrestle with these things, because it's just so important that we go beyond just the surface, the feelings, the first things that we assume, and that we're wrestling with these issues on deep levels. I want to give you a quote of something I saw, and I'd love for you to kind of critique it for me, because this is of a quote that I've seen from a few pastors and people that I respect, people that I love, people that have helped me in my life and then even beyond. And here is the quote: "Hey, we don't vote a person for a person, we vote for a platform." And that was said from the pulpit, right? And I've seen that in several different instances. We don't vote for a person, we vote for a platform. Could you offer a critique of that kind of of what you understand that kind of like not ideology, but that kind of understanding to be? Does it fall into one of those categories you just outlined, or is there something else to that?
Well, I'm going to guess that when a person said we're voting for a platform, not a person, that was a way of justifying a vote for Trump, right? Because we don't like Trump as a person, but we can vote for the broad agenda of the Republican Party. That's my
Right.
interpretation. I think that maybe characterizes the nature of our two-party system. Our parties are not actually defined by an ideology as spelled out in a platform. They publish platforms, nobody reads them, nobody cares. The parties are tribes of aggregate interests and conflicting ideologies. And when you're voting for a party, you're essentially signifying, I want to be part of this team. My own voting strategy, I very much prefer divided government because I don't trust, I think both parties embody injustice in their unthinking tribal loyalties. They both have some good things they stand for, and they both have a whole lot of bad things they stand for. And so I feel most comfortable, most safe in divided government when the parties check and balance each other. That's when democracy works the best. Unfortunately, it looks like we may actually have a Republican trifecta. We're recording this just a week after the election.
Yes.
And I think that's a bad thing. It'd be a bad thing if the Democrats had a trifecta. I think it'd be a bad thing if the Republicans do. They might be more efficient, but they'll be more efficient in both the good and the bad things that they stand for. And I don't like that. I'm scared of that. So I think it's a misnomer to think that parties actually stand for their platforms. Platform's a PR document. It doesn't actually mean much. It's a signaler about which interest groups are being bought off by the parties. Pardon my cynicism, but this is how deep it goes.
Hey, man, it's all good.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't take the platforms too seriously.
Yeah, you're in good company here if you want your cynicism to kind of run free, because like we've read, big fans of Catherine Stewart's Power Worshippers, big fan of Tim Alberta's book. Like we understand that like there's forces that have kind of introduced themselves into the church environment and as a result has really kind of changed a lot of the way that people interact with politics and their faith. Actually, when we spoke with Sam Perry, I've mentioned this before, but it's so impactful. Like he talked about a survey he did while Trump was still president, where he had asked Christians something along the lines of, do you believe God, plays a hand in selecting our leaders or something like that? And as you would expect, 80-90% of evangelicals said, yep, absolutely.
Straight out of Romans 13, sure.
Yeah, and then they issued a survey when Biden got elected, and that number was like cut in half. So basically, it's like you went from like 80% to 40%, which in our discussion with Sam, he was just like, so politics is affecting our theology. It's affecting how we actually engage or view God in some form or capacity. And like, that was just such a scary thing for me to hear, because you're like, wait a minute, this faith that I belong to, because I'm a Christian too, and I'm a Democrat. So like that is possible, even though I've been told I can't be a Christian and a Democrat. But, the fact that politics can have this sort of effect in a negative way on our faith, I think really should, open up politicians' eyes to what they're doing to theology. And I tell you that story because I want to ask you this question. Like, we've seen the effect that politics can have on religion, but as a person that's steeped in the intelligence community, are there like real world national security implications for kind of the rise of Christian nationalism in America?
Well, this is where we should talk about Russia. I confess I have a harder time wrapping my head around this because this is a bit speculative, but you do hear occasionally some pundits on the right admiring Russia. They're taking Vladimir Putin's propaganda at face value. Putin says that Russia essentially is is a Christian nation, right? They are pretty clearly Christian nationalist with the way they marry the Orthodox Church with Russian nationalism. And he critiques the West for its moral degeneracy. It's very similar to the critique that a lot of conservative Christians have made of America. And so you have conservative Christians and the Russian government saying the same thing about America, and that makes the conservative Christians look at Russia and they're like, maybe you're a fellow traveler, maybe you've got a point. And I do think that tends to help people on the right downplay the evil of Vladimir Putin's regime and how tyrannical and murderous it is and how it's broken international law by invading Ukraine. I confess, I just don't understand why people on the right are eager to abandon Ukraine. If you want to compete in great power politics, helping Russia defeat Ukraine is a good idea. So there you have it. I do think that there is a national security implication by making people on the right more sympathetic to Russia than they deserve.
So I would love for you, if to the level of comfort that you feel, and again, on this podcast, we've had people say all sorts of things, right? There is no filter necessary. We've had this co-founder of the Satanic Temple and the president of the Heritage Foundation on this podcast. So it's a pretty wide range.
And Stephen Wolfe.
And Stephen Wolfe. Yeah, we have had Stephen Wolfe on the podcast. But what are you concerned about? And are you concerned with a Trump reelection and maybe the breakdown of democratic norms? Because that seems to be a really big call from the left. Trump is going to take away our rights. He's going to, hurt human rights in general, make human rights violations. He has unfettered power because of this decision, Trump v. United States. And, but are you concerned? And if so, what are those specific concerns that you're thinking about with a Trump 2024 presidency? And feel free to speculate. Obviously, it's going to be speculative in some ways, or just stick in your wheelhouse with your expertise, whichever you'd like.
Yes, I'm concerned. I do think there's some alarmism out there. I think some of the more hysterical things you hear on the left. Look, Trump's not going to suspend the Constitution, or if he tries, I think that people will stop him. We're not that far gone yet. I don't think Trump is going to try to pass a law that gives legal privileges to his supporters and officially persecute the rest. It's not that pronounced of a sort of authoritarianism. Here's the kind of thing that I think are likely to happen. Number one, on foreign policy, I think he has bad foreign policy. I think that maybe Russia wins the war. I think that Ukraine is defeated. I think that empowers China, so on and so forth. I think that the quality of governance overall in America will continue to decline. And I will say continue. It's not unique to Trump. As corruption and incompetence become more the norm, it's just going to be a slow, gradual, imperceptible decline in the quality of public services. And I can't point to one thing and prove to you that it's because of Trump, but I know that the overall quality is likely to decline over time as you have more corruption, more incompetence at the highest levels of government. But I'm concerned as well, number three, for the erosion of the guardrails, the checks and balances, the rule of law that keep democracy working and happening. Again, it takes a lot of time for that stuff to erode. So again, I don't think Trump's going to declare himself dictator, but maybe 50 years from now, his far off successor will. I don't think that's irrational to fear that. Let me give you one very specific example I think I'm very worried about. If Trump actually does pardon the January 6th rioters, people have been convicted of violent crimes, of storming the Capitol, beating police officers, that would be, to me, an indication of that we should be pretty alarmed. Think about for a moment what would happen if Trump pardons the J6ers. It gives a blanket sense of immunity or felt permission by Trump's most ardent supporters across the country to act with impunity and do whatever they want at any political rally, at any political event, anywhere in the country. They will think they can intimidate, bully, and even attack local officials, state officials, county officials, federal officials with impunity and get away with it because Trump will just give them a pardon. It converts, to be very hyperbolic, it converts the MAGA movement into the brown shirts, right? To be as alarmist as I can be, it would convert the MAGA movement into the brown shirts, to the, Nazi stormtroopers who helped secure and keep Hitler in power. That's what pardoning January 6th, that's the road it could lead us down. Again, it won't get us there overnight, but that would be, to me, deeply alarming if he undermines the rule of law, politicizes the judicial system, and gives a blanket sense of immunity to the J6ers.
I'm really glad that you're much more optimistic about the institution than I am. I mean, like,
that was optimistic.
It's much more.
Thanks for your optimism, Paul.
Compared to where I'm at, because we were just talking about this last night on a live episode we did, and also I've just been having these same conversations with friends and family about the pardoning of the J6ers, and obviously, like, you'll get the what about the BLM protesters and blah blah blah, and I'm just like, fine, they did bad stuff, they should be prosecuted, they shouldn't be pardoned, be bailed out or whatever, but like but also, like, if he doesn't pardon them, like, I think Trump is going to sort of weigh the two of, like, if I don't pardon them, like that was sort of a mainstay of his rallies. I mean, he starts with, like, the national anthem that the J6ers were singing from, like, their cell block, and if he comes out and doesn't pardon them, I think he's gonna lose, like, maybe, I don't know. I mean, he's pretty untouchable, but, like, I don't think it would sit well. So I mean, I'm under the impression that I think he probably will pardon them in some form or capacity. And which leads me to kind of think a little bit more about sort of this nationalism thing that you had talked about earlier. Like, you've spent a lot of time, military, CIA, intelligence. Like, I think that your views on, like, nationalism are colored by, like, a rich experience kind of in, systems and governments that probably we would never want to have replicated here. So, like, can you talk a little bit about sort of, like, your background and how that does color, like, or how it informs sort of your views on nationalism that you're afraid of seeing here?
Well, I spent 20 years working on what was then called the War on Terror, 10 years in government, and then, kept on studying it as a scholar afterwards. And one of the big questions we had was, essentially, why do they hate us? What's the process of radicalization? What creates a group of military-aged young men to adopt an ideology that leads them to commit acts of political violence? And don't want to overdraw the analogy. There's some differences, but I think you can say that any social movement has its moderates and it has its extremists, and some small portion of extremists are open to the idea of violence, and that's essentially how I understand January 6th. It was a very small number of people who committed an act of political violence, but they were, I believe, enabled by a much broader community that gave them a sense of felt permission that they could do this. And again, that's direct parallel with what we were looking at with combating the jihadists. There's an extremely large pool of people sympathetic to the cause, or you might call them broadly Islamist without being violent jihadists. And the Islamists were the ocean in which the extremists swam. They were the enabling condition. And so that's kind of how I think of sort of Christian nationalism, right? Most Christian nationalism is fairly innocuous. It's peaceful, it's moderate, it's popular, it's very widespread. And I'm talking about the Christian nationalism of a Star-Spangled Flag, and waving the flag on Memorial Day at church and saying, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord," Psalm 33:12, and implying that that's America. Right? That's Christian. That's, by the way, that's bad biblical hermeneutics. That verse is not about America, but it's very common in a lot of evangelical churches in America. It's not storming the Capitol, but it's very common. The guy who storms the Capitol, he's definitely there at the Memorial Day, church service, and he gets that sense of felt permission by the widespread popular misconception of American identity. And so that's the dynamic we need to keep in mind. There's a widespread popular social movement. It's not wrong or illegal or violent, but it does provide the grounds, that it's the seedbed in which extremism can grow.
That is like so insightful, because just thinking about that, we wonder like, hey, where did that come from? How did they get that? Was it really that bad? Or like making that connection between, hey, I mean, I just like having, the flag in my church. I just like, I felt really good when I heard a hymn sung when President Trump won. I felt like that was really, like, I felt emotional, like in a good way. Like that made me feel proud and all that stuff. And connecting that to, hey, by the way, this creates a group out of which a smaller group of more extreme people that are open to violence can feel acceptance, can feel support, and without which they really wouldn't be able to do what they're doing. I think that is such a good connection, because we often wonder like, well, what's wrong with me just doing this? Well, maybe nothing inherently except, like you said, bad hermeneutics. But what makes it wrong is this: you're creating an environment in which these kinds of things can be supported, accepted, or right at a minimum just kind of ignored, or hey, they were trying to be patriots in their minds, right? Which is what a lot of people think. I've had people very close to me, the peaceful protest. That's what they call it. The January 6th. And so like it absolutely is all interconnected. And what do you think that I want to kind of shift in thinking about, like, as we're thinking about foreign policy, as we have these conflicts around the world where America is intertangled in some way. I know you've done a lot of work on just war theory, and I'd love for you to kind of talk with us a little bit about what just war theory is, and how can churches kind of navigate the difficult part of people that are that are in the military, that are going to be sent into some of these conflicts, that may have to find themselves in violent conflict in service to their country. My nephew just went into the Air Force, and so at a time when there's many conflicts that are happening and seem like they're growing around the world, I'd love for you to kind of talk about that, and then anything broader about the conflicts that we're seeing right now in general, in their importance.
Thank you for the question. Before I tackle just war theory, let me just say, on the kind of the mainstream, Christian nationalism stuff, I think that the solution is a healthy God and country patriotism. I think it's actually really important to have healthy patriotism as the best antidote to the unhealthy nationalism. I don't want to fight Christian nationalism by saying, stop being patriots, don't like America, and keep God out of the public square. That's not at all what I'm saying. We need healthy patriotism, and Christians should absolutely be in the public square advocating for justice and advocating for our values, with a few sort of caveats on that. So I just want to make sure I'm clear on that. I think the way to fight Christian nationalism is with a healthy patriotism. Now, that leads to your question about just war theory, because patriotism does recognize that our country does sometimes have a responsibility, sadly, to use the sword that God has given the state to uphold justice, order, and peace. It is a legitimate function of the state. This is what Caesar is for. Romans 13, God gave the state a sword and permission to use it. I know that's the truth that a lot of people are uncomfortable with. I found it, especially a lot of younger Christians are kind of instinctive pacifists because they've never been taught otherwise. But I think, while I can respect individual conscience, I think Caesar has no grounds to lay down the sword. It would be a dereliction of duty. It would be irresponsible and immoral. And so we do have occasions when we must use the sword against those who present a violent challenge to public order and justice and peace. When there is a violent challenge, you have to use violence in turn. That also points to Genesis 9, in the covenant with Noah, where God says, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man will his blood be shed. God is delegating, he's commissioning us, he's authorizing us, giving us the responsibility to uphold earthly order and peace, even with the tool of violent coercion. That's clearly the case when you're being attacked. As Ukraine was attacked by Russia, I think Ukraine is most clearly and obviously fighting a just war of self-defense against Russia. And when they're fighting a just war, they're permitted to seek allies. And I think it is wise and prudent for us to assist their fight for independence. I think it is both strategically wise and morally permissible for us to do so. Israel, same thing, is fighting a war to defend itself, recover hostages, and live free of fear that they've been living with for decades. They've been the victims of essentially a century-long onslaught against their legitimacy as a state, and it is right for them to fight for their own independence. I will say, just war theory also teaches that we should fight with discrimination, with proportionality. We should fight using only the minimum amount of violence necessary to accomplish our ends, and we should be careful not to cause more damage than necessary, not to kill civilians if possible. And I would actually offer some criticism. I don't think Israel's been as careful as it should have been. And particularly in the opening months of the war against Hamas, I think Israel was a little bit too lax in how it targeted militants. I think that they've probably tightened it up since then, but they were not careful enough. So I would offer some criticism there. And then I would also criticize Israel and the United States for failing to offer a vision of post-war justice and peace. Because just war is supposed to result in a better peace. There should be a vision of just politics in the aftermath of war. War should result in some just arrangement. And I don't see Israel, Netanyahu has not outlined what kind of post-war settlement he's after, other than killing Hamas. Killing Hamas is a just act, and it is a necessary prerequisite to some kind of post-war peace, but it is not the whole of it. And I think that we should resurrect some kind of plan for a two-state settlement. I think justice requires Palestinian sovereignty. It requires Israeli sovereignty. It requires Israeli security. It also requires Palestinian sovereignty and dignity and security. That's the post-war vision I'd advocate for. And if the war results in that, great. But I don't hear Netanyahu or Biden or Harris or Trump talking about that.
Yeah. So statistically, most people don't make it to the last 10 minutes of hour-long podcasts. And I'm about to ask you a series of questions that I feel are probably going to be the most important. So I don't know, maybe our audience can play the podcast backwards, or I don't know. But I want to talk about hope and also what to do about Christian nationalism, because I really appreciated you identifying that Christian nationalism is almost on a spectrum. You got the hey, we're gonna have a 4th of July thing at our church, but that on one end, and then you've got the we want to basically put Bibles in the 10 Commandments in every classroom in America kind of thing, kind of as the other end. So if Christian nationalism is sort of this really, really bad pox on the American Christian church, because I think it ruins our witness. I think we tell people we're Christians, we believe in Jesus, we want grace, love, blah, blah, blah. And then people are like, yeah, but what about those other guys, So what's the answer to Christian nationalism, and who bears kind of the brunt of the responsibility to kind of help our country, separate itself in a healthy way where both patriots and believers, can enjoy sort of this pluralistic society we live in, while also wanting the best for our country.
Yeah. So my answer on this all year long was something like this: victory has 1,000 fathers, and defeat is an orphan. If you want to see Christian nationalism, less popular, it has to lose. you have to defeat the thing, and that means defeat at the polls. It also means intellectual defeat through debate and argument and persuasion. It also means, proper teaching about ecclesiology and political theology and all that. Well, I just won, and so I'm not sure what my talking point is now. Clearly, I don't think that the 2024 referendum vote was a referendum on Christian nationalism, and so the right shouldn't take it as full endorsement for all of its stuff. It was a referendum on inflation, which turns out to be deeply unpopular with most Americans. That was what the election was mostly about, and crime and immigration. Nonetheless, the right will take it as vindication for all of its ideas, which it shouldn't. So in a sense, I think that the best thing we can do is let them fail. They're going to overstretch themselves. The winners of elections always do. They overinterpret their mandate, they overplay their hand, and they become deeply unpopular. So let that play out. The Democrats will pick up seats in 22. I think that the danger here is that if there's a strong economic recovery, the Republicans could ride that to victory after victory, and will interpret that as vindication of whatever ideas they're championing, rather than vindication of the economy. And I worry about that a little bit, but I do think that on these cultural issues, the country's just not on their side. The country does not endorse Christian nationalism, and I think we can safely assume the nationalists will overplay their hands, and that will open up space, I hope, for a real conservatism to regain ground. I would not want to see progressivism gain ground, but I want to see an older-fashioned kind of libertarian conservatism make its case again.
Yeah, I really like that. I actually voted third party in this election and libertarian, and the more in the past, I was like, I don't know if I'm libertarian. I feel like we need to have these strong morals that are pushed on kind of everyone. And then I started to feel like, I'd kind of rather the government kind of be just out of just about everything unless they have to be. Whatever that balance is, I'm not sure, but I feel like it's just too much right now. Go ahead.
It's interesting. As a practical matter, I find myself thinking and feeling more libertarian by the day because I just don't trust the government under either party. But theologically, I think there is a different answer. And this is, the subject of 2 books from now. The vision of justice I want to uphold is of I'm going to call it a natural law republic, which includes democracy insofar as a republic treats all citizens with equality and seeks the citizen's voice. But it is rooted in a transcendent moral vision, but it's not a moral vision of Christianity. It's a moral vision of natural law. I think that's the right answer, and that's what we should advocate for. There's no party that stands for that right now, and so that's why my instincts are just more libertarian. But I would want to see over time the growth of a voice for a natural law republicanism, small r republicanism, take root in American political culture. It's not there right now. It'll take a generation, but that's what I would hope and pray for in the long run.
Yeah, maybe just go into that just a little bit more. I mean, we only have a few minutes left, and we will have a last question about what you're working on. But I was going to ask what you're working on. So I'd love for you to go into that just a little bit more. What are we talking about when we say natural law, that it's transcendent? And what do we mean when we say little r Republican? What's going on with that? I'd love to hear more about that. I'm really interested.
Well, what I'm working on is it's a trilogy. The Christian Nationalism book is volume 1. Volume 2 is probably a book about the progressive left and what's wrong with it. And volume 3 is the kind of the way forward. What is the right answer? And I think the right answer is natural law republicanism, which is basically democracy, civil rights, and all that. But it's given a bit more grounding, a bit more philosophical rigor, and a bit more explanation of how it ties to Christian political theology. We should seek justice, not theocracy. By what standard of right and wrong then do we govern? I think the standard isn't the Mosaic law. I think it's natural law, which is accessible to all people, Christian, non-Christian, Jew and Gentile. Everybody has access to natural law. And by the way, everybody, every religion, every civilization, every government bans murder, bans theft, right? Lying is wrong. quite a lot endorse the golden rule. This is what I mean by natural law. It's universal moral principles that are applicable across all cultures and times and nations. That's the moral standard that it should inform our public life together. That's the grounds on which we Christians should advocate for our values, and we should, but we should do it on the basis of natural law, not special revelation. I think that's the key.
Hey, Paul, how can people get a hold of you, follow your work, buy your book, and then lastly, maybe you can close us out with like what gives you hope for the future?
Yeah, you can buy my books on Amazon. I'm on Twitter, Paul D. Miller 2, and I go for a year or so without tweeting, and then I tweet a flurry in a week, like I did this week. I'm always consider getting off completely. As for getting a hold of me, just don't. I'm too busy writing the books. No, I'm kidding. Of course.
It sounds like me.
Yeah, I'm actually relatively easy to find on the Georgetown University website, especially if anybody wants to invite me for another conversation, podcast, lecture, talk, panel, whatever. I'm always available for that. So Twitter and that sort of thing. I'm available.
And hope. What gives you hope?
The fact that we are citizens of the kingdom of heaven. Our citizenship is not of this world fundamentally, and that is a kingdom of perfect justice and perfect peace, and that should give us all hope. If your earthly politics are discouraging, and look, in 21st century America is not a terrible place to live. We should be grateful for what we have in a democracy. By the way, the election was not contested. It was a pretty clear winner. There was no lawsuits. There was no recounts. Like, I'm grateful for that. I really am. So that gives me a little bit of hope that our institutions of democracy are still working. Wheels are still moving. I think that many of the checks and balances are still working. So we can take some comfort in the fact that if you're discouraged by the election last week, there's still a lot to be encouraged by. I love this country. But be more fundamentally encouraged and hopeful in our citizenship in the kingdom of heaven.
That's really awesome. Well, thank you so much, Paul, for stopping by and chatting with us. This has been a pretty phenomenal conversation. I know I got a lot from it. So for our audience listeners, we will make sure we put all the links for Paul and the notes so that way you can't get a hold of him. As always, make sure you keep your conversations not right or left, but up, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Right.